Welcome back to Ryan O'Brien's Bible Bistro. I'm the Ryan half.
Hey, and I'm the Brian half.
And this is the Bistro.
Ryan O'Brien's Bible Bistro. It's good to be with you today, Ryan.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Ryan. We're doing things a little bit different.
Yes.
I'm kind of cutting off the intro because,
are we still going to have the music? Or?
Oh, there'll be music.
Okay.
Music will never die.
Right. I love our music.
Yes, but I was watching Netflix the other day.
Right.
And it's like, oh, do you want to watch the intro to the show? And I'm like, no, I already know the intro. Skip.
I think there are two kinds of people. I think there are those who like the intro and those who don't like the intro. I watch the intro. It sets me up for it. It's kind of like, I don't know, the beginning of a book of the Bible, for example. It kind of prepares you for what's to come.
Now that you put it, everything's in spiritual terms. You got to put it back. Helps you understand the context. Am I right?
Well,
but we're still going to do. We're going to do a little recap here. So recap. That's an important part of the show intro.
It is.
We've been going through Ephesians, and it's been great. We've had some great feedback recently on some of the past episodes about the ideas of holiness.
Yes.
And
got some good comments from a listener on that, and some.
And I will say one of my favorites is I really like the holiness, and then the one we just released this last week about redeeming the time.
Right. It's interesting because we have lots of listeners that have different kinds of tastes and things, and so a lot of people really responded well to going through Ephesians kind of as a Bible study. I've heard one of our listeners talk about they really enjoy that format, but we've had others that say, I kind of miss the randomness. So going forward, we'll probably do a little bit of both. But we've been in Ephesians, but we're going to go to the book of Revelation. We haven't been in Revelation for a while.
Revelation's always a crowd pleaser. But before we do that, since we're cutting out the intro, I just need to remind everyone, if you're enjoying the podcast and you're enjoying this, please consider supporting us. We've got a Patreon set up, and so you can support us monthly. And if you do, for 3 months, you can get a coffee mug or a t-shirt. And the first round of coffee mugs
have gone out.
So, and they're making waves. I got a text today from someone and it had the mug, and they were drinking it and said the most desired mug in the house.
It's rare right now. I mean,
it's a very limited edition.
It's a limited edition right now. But no, that's great. It seems like we just kind of do this off the cuff.
Yes.
There's lots of work that goes into it, especially on your side, Ryan. Lots of technical equipment, lots of studio equipment, that kind of thing.
And it is, and I say it's a labor of love for both you and I. We enjoy doing it. But if you would support us, I'm here in Bloomington today, and you drive over to Indianapolis, and it just, to help
Gas
us along.
isn't like it used to be.
Nothing's like it used to be.
Hey, we should give a shout out to Broadleaf Productions as well, who are hosting us today in their spacious studios.
Spaciousness
in downtown East Bloomington. So
wait, is East Bloomington its own town that has its own downtown?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're in beautiful downtown East Bloomington, Illinois today.
Yeah, so thanks to Broadleaf Productions.
Yeah, absolutely.
See them for all your video needs in Central Illinois.
You get to Indiana, you cross the border, it's all me, baby. Let him go. He's smiling back over here. All right, well, let's jump into Revelation. So we've done several on Revelation, and we've talked about the two witnesses.
Yes.
We've talked about just the imagery and so forth, what's going on in there. But now we're gonna move a little bit further into Revelation and talk about something that's really, this can be a brain buster for some people.
Yeah, well, it's a good example, I think, and for a couple of different reasons. Is we've talked before about how the imagery of Revelation needs to be read in symbolic ways. We've shown that, I think, pretty clearly. This is a good example of this. We're in Revelation 17 today, and the image is, the way that it would have been put in the King James, the Whore of Babylon. Now it's usually put a little bit nicer terms. I don't know that it should be.
Well, yeah, let's roll with it.
Well, anyway, but Revelation 17, there's lots of great images here, and I think this is a good passage for us to look at for a couple of reasons. One is I think it's instructive for how we do interpretation of the book of Revelation. But the other thing, when we really start talking about, because again, people kind of have this expectation of the book of Revelation that it is going to give us kind of an outline of future history, right? And when you begin to tell people, well, really it's kind of, using these figures to talk about things that are going on in the present reality of the Christians. Now, it does deal a little bit with the future, I think, but it's really about how to live in the Roman Empire. And so John uses lots of very clear images. Here's a problem. I've always noticed when I teach this, I get to a certain point and students will begin to say, well, then how does this apply to us? Like this, if this is all about the Roman Empire. So I think this is a good example of how we can also bring some of the principles that John is teaching in relationship to the empire in which they were living. And I think we can use some of those principles in applying to any country, any kingdom, any context that we live in today.
Yeah, and I think that's really an important thing. So we're not just looking at this book as something other, but it's really meaningful for us today as well.
Well, if you go back to our introduction to Revelation, we talked then about it's kind of a discipleship manual. It's really about how to live in the context in which we find ourselves, and that's what I really think. And it's been interesting. I think I've mentioned before, I've taught this in different cultures. Not only in the United States, but I've taught it in other places. And the interesting thing about that, I think, is you see how in different political context and different cultural context, the message does pertain. It does have a universal message. Right. Very specific references, I think, here, but then in a general.
Yeah. And on another note, we've been going through Revelation. I said this on the phone to you this last week. So I've been reading Day by Day Bible, throughout the year. And I just went through Amos. And well, one of the things, like we've been teaching Revelation with my small group and reading Amos. And I saw some of very similar, I've seen these similar languages where we're going to talk a little bit about some wrath that's been poured out, but it comes back to it in the wraths in Revelation. It says, but they would still not repent. Yeah. And then I was reading Amos. And he's delivering all these things. God's saying, like, I did all these things to you, Israel, but you would still not return to me. And I was just like, aha, this, I mean, I knew there was these connections, but to read them and say, like, you see the whole story. Again, we talk about this all the time, the narrative going through all of Scripture. And God has done this little revelation piece to Israel before to try to draw them back to himself.
The interesting thing, I say this all the time, that you really know you're in trouble when you start understanding other parts of Scripture by the book of Revelation. And we had Tripper Longman on not too long ago, reading Revelation through Old Testament eyes. Yeah. I mean, it is full of and we're going to see this again today, full of Old Testament imagery. And so, as I said before, understanding the Old Testament thoroughly, including the prophets, including Exodus is going to be big for what we talk about today. Understanding these parts of the Old Testament narrative are crucial if we're going to understand the message of the book of Revelation.
Yeah. So. And I would just say this for everyone. I know sometimes Revelation, as I've taught it in my small group, it's like this, I'm nervous about it. I don't understand anything. But it's like, and we've said before, go slowly through it, take it at a time, and, work through it. Because I think it does illuminate so much more as you look back to kind of go, I see the connection here. It's not, there's no Gnostic secret knowledge out there. It's like, no, this is a continuation of the narrative that's been coming. That's been coming the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Well, let's go on and then look at it a little bit. Just, we're always talking about the importance of context. So if you go back in chapter 16, what we have, and we've talked before, Revelation has these cycles of different sevens usually, and there are 7 bowls of wrath that are poured out by these 7 angels is where we are to this point. And chapter 16 kind of wraps up those 7 bowls of wrath that are being poured out on the earth. It says gaze, the Greek word gaze is what it's used there, earth, and we talked a little bit about that. So if you look at 16:16, just to kind of get us prepared for this. As that last bowl is poured out, it says, then they gathered the kings together to the place that is in Hebrew called Armageddon. So here's the mountain of Megiddo. Here's this place of this great battle. Great battles have taken place in the past. So the kings of the earth, we're going to see here in just a minute in chapter 17, are all gathered there together for this final climactic battle. Is kind of the idea. And then verse 17 says, the 7th angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice saying, it is done. And so all this stuff happens. There's again a big destruction scene, it seems like. Everything's kind of coming to an end. And then we get into 17, and I think 17 is kind of an explanation. Go ahead and read verses 1 and 2 then. It's an explanation of these 7 bowls of wrath, basically. But go ahead and read 17, 1 and 2 for me, if you would.
Yeah, 17, 1 and 2. Here we go. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries."
Okay, so let's go back. Lots going on here. So one of these 7 angels that had the 7 bowls come and basically says, "I'm gonna explain this to you." And the image that John sees, then he says, "I'm going to show you this punishment," which those 7 bowls of wrath have really been about judgment or punishment coming upon the enemies of God's people, those who have attempted to lead God's people astray. And so what happens here, it says, just to show you a couple things, again, it's a great prostitute or great, the whore, the harlot is the word that's sometimes used. And it's interesting because I think we're looking at a figurative sense here, and infidelity or what's the other word I was looking for? This idea adultery, this idea of sexual sin is used throughout the Old Testament, right? And what do you usually see? What context do you see it used in there?
Israel's unfaithfulness.
Israel's unfaithfulness. The idea is that God is the husband to his people, and when they go aside to other gods, to other idols, and they begin to give power to these other false gods, then this is a spiritual act of unfaithfulness, right? Of adultery, spiritual adultery. And so that's why I think we have this image, this one that the kings of the earth here, again, like we saw in 16, these kings that have been gathered for this battle, and there's this judgment coming on them. The kings of the earth have come together, and in a figurative way, they have gone into the seduction of this woman. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, this woman, I understand to be symbolic of Rome. Okay. I meant to show you that up in 16:16. I forgot that. It starts to talk about, if you look in 16:19, it talks about the great city, split into 3 parts. The city of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. So you see how Rome here, the great city, is referred to and as a her. And then immediately you have this image of this harlot. So that's why the context, I think, helps lead us toward this idea of Rome being the primary reference here. So Rome, in their power and in their influence, have seduced, if you will, the kings of all these other nations to go to bed with them, so to speak, to commit adultery with them economically and politically and culturally. Basically, these are the things that are being worshipped instead of the true God. And even it goes into idol worship. But even if we're not talking, even if it's not quite as on the nose as emperor worship, as is part of what we understand Revelation to be referring to, or the worship of idols, it's looking for this economic, political, military, cultural power. It's looking to that for our salvation, rather than trusting in God for our salvation. That's really what the primary image here is.
Yeah, and I think, we talking about the seductiveness of it. I mean, I think we even go back to the beginning of Revelation, where it's the letters to the churches are, you're doing well in this, but like the culture's
be careful,
is reeling you in. So it's the seductive nature of Rome.
And so that's why I think this idea of spiritual adultery, this idea that Rome is seducing, is enticing people to trust in their power rather than trusting in God's. Now, here's the other thing: this is just a minor detail. We're going to get back to it. In fact, the angel's going to interpret this in the last half of the chapter. So I'm trying to keep from reading ahead. But in verse 1, it says that I will show you the great prostitute who sits by many waters. And water here has to do, I think, with the way that trade took place, the way that political messages were sent back and forth by rivers and by sea and this kind of thing. Later in the chapter, it's going to very specifically say these many waters are referring to these various kings and nations and peoples. So this is talking about, I think, the connectedness. So here's an example today. If you think about the way that image and commerce and these kind of things flow. For us, it would be kind of the idea, I think, of the internet, of connections in this way. Mm-hmm. And again, I think it's something that we have to be careful of, something that we can be seduced by, again, something that can draw us aside from the trust in God. Not that I'm saying that this is a direct reference to that, but
right.
it's the same kind when we're talking about.
It's a concept, something that can easily draw you away.
Yeah. And you begin to trust in it. You begin to put all of your faith in this system of mm-hmm. commerce, this system of trade, rather than putting your trust in God to be able to care for you. And so that's what I think is the primary message here. Mm-hmm. So if we go on to verse 3, let me read this. And it talks about the wine of her adulteries. Again, we saw the cup of her wrath that God gave, and then we'll get down to this a little bit later. But look at verse 3. I'm just going to spend a moment on this. It says, then the angel carried me away in the Spirit. Of course, John goes back to this even in chapter 1. He talks about being in the Spirit on the Lord's day when this revelation mm-hmm. of Jesus Christ first came to him. But this idea of in the Spirit is basically he's saying, I was being shown these things by the Holy Spirit. These things were being revealed to me so I can mm-hmm. then tell them to you. Angel carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. And I thought about this. This is, a minor image. But when you think about
Exodus.
Yeah. I mean,
the Israelites have been in the wilderness before.
They've been in the wilderness before. We're going to see wilderness. We've seen it already in chapter 12 of the book of Revelation as a place of safety. And so here's what I was thinking as I was kind of preparing for this. I was thinking the wilderness is a place of ambiguity for God's people. Okay. Now, So wilderness was punishment in the sense that, the people didn't trust in God and therefore they wandered in the wilderness. But the other thing is the wilderness is looked back at by the people who settle in the land. They look back at the time in the wilderness as a time that proved God's provision. Right? It proved God is able to provide for them. And that's kind of how wilderness is for us, I think, all the time for God's people. It's a place of uncertainty. It's a place of difficulty, we could say. Mm-hmm. And that's in some ways where God's people is in Rome. They're in the wilderness in the sense that it's an inhospitable place. But at the same time, it's a place where God is still able to provide. And it can even be a place of protection and safety for God's people. There are times where God's people flee to the wilderness. You think about sometimes the prophets flee into the countryside. The other wilderness story I always think about, which is an echo of Exodus, and I think intentionally so, is when Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days at the mm-hmm. beginning of his ministry. Same thing there. It's a time of trial.
Temptation.
It's a time of temptation. It's a time of testing. There is, not to put too fine a point on it, but Satan tries to seduce him into trusting for his provision for bread, for example, mm-hmm. in his own strength.
Power on the earth.
So we have these temptations for Jesus to do it in a different way than is what is God's plan. But it is also, it's a time of testing, but it's also a time and a place of God's caring for him and provision, I would say. He's able to withstand the test. Man, I've got a frog in my throat today.
You're all right.
So anyway, wilderness is a place of ambiguity, I think, for God's people. And then it goes on, it says, then I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, and that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we've seen these 7 heads and these 10 horns before. Go ahead and read. There's a couple of different places I think I set there for you to read.
Jeremiah?
No. This is Revelation
12.
Yeah.
12:3.
Yeah.
So Revelation 12:3. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head.
And then in was it 13 I gave to you?
13:1.
13:1.
The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads.
So you see the 7 head, 10 horns repeated, and 7, of course, is kind of a number of completion. The 10 horns, and there's some debate on this. The horns stand for kings. It's clear. All this goes back to Daniel chapter 7. That's the images that are being used. So the question here is if we're talking about particular kings, are these 10 particular kings? Now, I think they are. I think they're talking about Roman emperors, and I think this is part of how we date the book of Revelation. Probably too much to get into right now. It's just a huge topic.
Yeah.
But there are other There are other ways of understanding these 10. 7 obviously is a number of completeness. In other words, their authority or their power is sufficient. But 10 can either be seen that way, kind of like 10 fingers, 10 toes kind of thing, but not necessarily the toes. But I know you have 11. But the sorry,
what's this, comedy hour?
Sorry. So it could be that kind of thing, or it could be, again, reference to specific kings. I tend to take it as specific emperors that's being referred to, but we can go back there and talk about that, like I said, another day. So this beast is scarlet. It's just like it's the same color that we see the dragon. Red or scarlet is the idea. Red speaks about typically danger. And we're going to see another use of that in just a minute. But it's this idea, this is not a friendly situation. This is
this is a danger.
And so, and also red and blood and this kind of thing. And persecution is one of the images it may bring to mind, as we'll see in just a little bit. And so the beast is read in the same way. Now it's covered, it says, with blasphemous names, and we see the same thing again with in Revelation 13, the image of blasphemous names written on it. And if you think about blasphemy, how would you describe or define blasphemy specifically?
Speaking against God, or speaking intentionally speaking incorrectly about God.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. I think blasphemy can also carry this connotation with it of trying to put yourself in God's place, or taking upon yourself things that belong rightfully to God. This is what Jesus is criticized for. When he's accused of blasphemy by the leaders in the Gospel of John, you might remember, it's because they were basically accusing him of healing on the Sabbath, and he says, "My Father works on the Sabbath, and I too am working to this very day." What John says there is that they said he's making himself equal with God. It's not only that he called God Father, but that he's making himself equal with God. So setting yourself up in this way of being worthy of God's praise, or having the power that God has. So again, when you think about the emperors of Rome, this is how I would understand this. One of the accusations that Christians have for them is they're putting themselves in this divine place, in this divine space. Whether we're talking about emperor worship specifically, which I think we are, or if we're talking simply about the function that they have, that they're seen as the savior of the world, that they're seen as the providers, that they are the bringers of peace.
Right.
So all these kind of titles that are given to the emperors, when Jesus is by Christians called, he is our peace.
Right.
Whoa.
Yeah.
He is the savior of the world. Now, wait a minute. I'm pretty sure I have a coin someplace with Caesar Augustus' picture on it with that. It's basically that he's saying that these human emperors have put themselves in place of God's role, is the way I understand it. Now, again, that's Rome, but I would think any system, Beale's in his commentary, his favorite word for this is world system. Any system that would put itself in a position where they are that system is trying to take for itself the power that belongs rightfully to God, whatever that is, to be the one who is the decider. I mean, I don't know where you want to go with this. The decider of justice, the one who's the giver of life, all of this. As Christians, we say we're not going to bow our knee to an idol, right?
Right.
And by that, what we mean is we're not going to. I got to be careful about my terms here. We're not going to give our allegiance to something that is trying to place itself in place of God. Instead, we are going to acknowledge God as the giver of all life, as the one who is the one who brings true judgment, true justice, these kind of things. So, any thoughts on that, or any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really. When we kind of had this conversation last evening, but just like justice and what does that look like? And it's so easy for us to say, like, this is true justice, but like,
right.
I was reading a book from N.T. Wright, or listening to a book about 12 broken signposts. And he says justice is one of these things. And he's like, typically when there's justice on earth, we sometimes see there might be an imbalance that even in the justice, it's not perfect justice.
It's not a releveling.
It's not a real, and so it's so easy to think that we are achieving justice. It's a seduction of, again, like we're achieving real peace, but it's not It's not real peace. It's not real justice outside of that thing. And so, this is one of the things I talked. This is during Pax Romana, isn't it? Like the Roman peace. So like this is real peace, but it's peace at a sword.
Yeah, and of course, my mind going back to Ephesians, where we talked about Jesus Christ is our peace, who made the two one, dividing taking away the dividing wall of hostility. That's it's the two groups becoming united is what is true peace, right? Is the way God created things to be. It's not we're going to acquiesce to the power of the military might of Rome. Not the kind of peace that's enforced at when Jerusalem on Passover, when the Roman guards were over the temple making sure that peace was kept. That's
and I think that's I think that's the trick, is we talk about this, like, how do we make this applicable to us today? Is kind of going, is like, again, I think as we talked about, those first 3 chapters of Revelation really set up what's to come afterwards, and seeking these churches that, you've done these things really well, but there's this piece that slides in. And so, and I think it slides in because it is seductive.
Yeah.
It's this seductive, like, oh, it's peace. Like we're not like here, but it's a false sense of that peace.
Let me give you one example from, I'm always loath to do this, but there's a couple of situations going on, and one of them, we trust God's vengeance. We don't try to exact vengeance ourselves, right? And yet I hear Christians sometimes, and myself in my heart at times, there are things that you think, oh, what a heinous thing that took place. Man, I really hope they get their own, even like yesterday when the guy, I was trying to pull over with the load in the back of the truck, and the guy whipped around me. I mean, man, I really hope that guy got what he deserved, but that's not my place, right? My place isn't to exact vengeance. Yeah, I won't tell you how I reacted, but it was less than Christ-like. But that's part of it. But here's the other example I was going to give is praying for peace. Like right now we have the situation in Russia and in Ukraine, and there's all kinds of different opinions, and you hear all kinds of different news about that. But I think my prayer is the same in essence, which is that the leaders of all of those nations would seek peace. Right, would seek a peaceful settlement there. and there are atrocities that are taking place. There's wrong, there's right. I'm not saying that, but ultimately our prayer is for God's peace to be, in the wisdom of the leaders of those nations and our own nation, seeking peace. And so there's just an example of how I think that applies in our context.
Yeah, it's there's one of these things, being on the right side of history, like, you having the right stance on it. But like, even that in and of itself can be like, is that real?
Yeah. Or is that, it can become for us an idol, right? To make sure that things are working out the way that we think that they should be working out. And I know this is a really difficult point for us to grasp, but trusting God is saying, even when by appearances, justice is not being done, to use, the signpost, we know ultimately God's justice is the only one that's going to be true, is going to be, complete. So,
and it's easy to think that our idea of justice is justice.
And if we have learned nothing, we should have learned that our perspective is woefully limited, that our ability to know fully is limited by our situation, our circumstance. Well, probably enough said about that right now.
Anyway, we've talked about that. Yeah, so that's kind of what I think about there is, in those verses, is just the blasphemous and keeping our head on straight there.
Yeah. So the 7 heads, 10 horns. I'm going to go ahead a little bit quicker here because I feel like I've kind of been going pretty slow. But verse 4, and I mean, there's so many details. I could, we could talk about this a long time.
Right.
But verse 4, it says the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet. Now, here's again that red. purple and red. So purple is a sign of royalty, right? These are very expensive dyes in the ancient world. I think we've mentioned this before.
Sea snail.
Yeah. In fact, we had early on, we had an episode about, royal purple from the time of David that has been discovered recently. But there are very particular sea mollusks that they extract this dye from. And it's a arduous process just to,
you got to dive down. It gets you get like an ounce out of it, maybe
not even an ounce. I think it's just a tiny amount, and to dye an entire robe. That's why the whole idea of a purple robe is an idea of luxury. But you're going to see this. You don't need just that purple, but look at this. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. So this is an idea of luxury. This is an idea of sumptuousness. It has to do with Rome profiting from the merchants that have brought, and again, this goes to the many waters. Do you remember me talking about the transport and trade and all this kind of thing? That Rome has profited from this position. It's put them in a position of wealth and a position of luxury at the expense of other peoples, and so that's part of, I think, what's being referred to here. And then it says she has a gold cup in her hand, filled with and this is really so abominable. Abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. So you're thinking here about this grossness. So within a Jewish context, this idea of uncleanness or abomination, these are things that are just you shouldn't. You don't want to put these things in your mouth. These are not things you want to drink. And so here's that she is getting the payback, if you will, God's vengeance on her. And so again, remember, this is an angel describing these bowls of wrath. Basically, it's coming to Rome what Rome deserves now. Rome is getting what Rome deserves. They're drinking now from the filth of these adulterous relationships with these other nations. It's been to their profit, but now they're getting the kind of the nastiness of it, I guess, is what I would describe in this way. Anything on? Were you gonna say something?
No, it just I had never thought of it as this is. It was just another sign of how bad it was, not necessarily that the cup represented wrath coming from God yet.
Well, I because of the gold cup back in chapter 16. So that's okay. Where. So if you remember back there in chapter 16, where was I? Verse 19.
And gave her a cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, but you get it. It's an interesting idea, because it's like, this is the result of what you have done. This is the, you're talking about justice. This isn't karma, but this is the result of your sin against God has resulted in this uncleanness that now you're partaking yourself.
Yeah. I just never tied that back to 16. I'd always thought it was just like another symbol of her being gross.
Well, it definitely is that. It's definitely I almost don't want to talk about it. It's a very strong image here. Yeah. I'll say that. Verse 5 says this name was written on her forehead. That was a mystery. And so this idea of written on a forehead, we've seen this a couple of other times with God's people. God's people had a seal on their foreheads. They had the name of God written on their foreheads. Forehead is a very prominent place. It's a place that's easily, it shows something about their identity. And so this on their foreheads, easily seen who this is. And so she is identified as Babylon the Great. So this is where we get the idea of the whore of Babylon. Now, Babylon, of course, is an Old Testament image. It's an Old Testament nation, right? This empire who came, and ultimately Babylon is the one who defeated the southern kingdom. Ultimately, they are the ones who destroyed the temple and took the people into captivity. Daniel, again, you remember a lot of these images come from Daniel. Daniel was taken into captivity. They put another king, it's a vassal king on the throne in Jerusalem. And pretty soon they ended up, defeating him because he tried to rebel against them, Zedekiah. And so Babylon is this place of captivity. it's a place of oppression, that for God's people. They are the image of defeat. So Babylon, again, is used not only here, but frequently in the New Testament, I would say. I don't know about frequently, but regularly in the New Testament as a symbol for Rome. It's basically like, fellows, here we are again. Our people, here we are again.
The evil empire.
Yeah. They are the dark side. And so Babylon here standing for Rome. I'm thinking about even First Peter, he ends with this idea of, Rome and we who are in Babylon, this kind of an idea. It's used regularly for this kind of an image. So Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes or harlots, however you want to say it. In other words, not only are they seducing themselves, but they are encouraging this. This is
it's spreading.
It's spreading. It's a promotion of this and of the abominations of the earth. So they are the ones who are bringing all of this. They're the enemies of God's people. Verse 6, I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. And this, of course, is what Revelation has been all about, staying true. In the seals, for example, the 7 seals, fourth or fifth seal, you have the slain saints under the altar who are slain because of their maintaining the testimony to Jesus. And so here's that kind of same kind of an idea that we have going on, that the persecution has come because they've stayed true to what God has called them to.
And this is kind of tied to Revelation 11, the 2 witnesses that we had an episode on about the witnesses bearing testimony as well.
That
being killed for their testimony.
That they've remained faithful even when, even in the in the face of this empire that's calling them to do other. That they've maintained truth to that. So again, application for us is that we remain true to the testimony about Jesus. We're willing to speak about Jesus and the truth of Jesus, no matter what consequences may come, no matter what difficulties might come as a result of that. So I think it's applicable. Again, it's using a very specific example here for God's people in their particular context, but that same principle applies for us in our context today.
Right. It's a story of God's triumph and our suffering.
So it says, John says, when I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast that she rides. So here, the rest of the chapter then is really an explanation of this idea. The beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns, he says. So the rest of this is kind of an explanation, if you will, of what's going on here in this context. So verse 8. Then, you go ahead and read a little bit.
Yeah. You want to do 8, 9, and 10?
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
The beast which you saw once was, now was not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come.
Okay, let's stop right there. Actually, I'd realized earlier I wanted to do the Jeremiah 51 that you're talking about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Let me say something about this was and is not and is to come. Already we've had one of the regular descriptions of God is the one who, one who was
and is to come.
Okay, so he is eternal. Sorry.
That's for all our fans who appreciate it when Brian asks me something and I have no idea where he's going.
What I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But this one, so what's the difference here? This is the one who was. So this is the force of evil against God's people in the past, is not, but will come again. It's the idea. So it's a negation in a sense of that idea. It's the opposite of God, if you will. It's this idea, if there is such thing as an opposite of God, which there isn't, but
it's an inverse of the idea.
Inverse of that idea of his eternal nature. And so that, if you notice, it says, and he will come to its destruction. So the abyss here, I think, even refers, if you think about later in the book of Revelation, he comes back to this idea that there is this time of being bound, and yet will be loosed, right? Yeah. But ultimately, the destruction is what comes. This is released for a little while, and is ultimately destroyed and thrown in the lake of fire. Is kind of the idea. So we're talking about, you mentioned that, we're talking about the victory of God's people is really what's going on. Don't worry about the power of this beast. Don't worry about all of that. We know ultimately the Lamb is victorious. Let's go back to Jeremiah 51, and I apologize for doing this out of order. This goes back to that cup, and I love this imagery in Jeremiah 51 that I think is being drawn on here partially.
Absolutely. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine, therefore they have now gone mad. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken. Wail over her. Get balm for her pain. Perhaps she can be healed.
So there's that idea that God used Babylon's power, which is frequently used in the Old Testament, that God used Babylon in order to bring his judgment, but then ultimately she will fall. And so he used this as a cup in his hand to do these. And so it's a very similar concept here. They've gotten drunk, these nations have gotten drunk with Rome's wine, but Rome is ultimately going to fall, and then they're going to wail over this great city. Similar image we're going to see here in just a moment. And ultimately then what happens is that God's victory is what comes as a result of this. That God's victory is ultimate in this. So that's what we have. Sorry, I wanted to go back there for that.
No, it's good.
Now go ahead and read 9 through 11. So we're going to see this was and is not, and will be again.
Yeah.
But
so this is verse 9. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was, and now is not, is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7, is going to his destruction.
So the 7 heads are the 7 hills, and this is probably a reference to Rome. Again, and later we're going to see he says very specifically, this is the great city. And I think there's some debates.
And Rome is known in history as a city on 7 hills.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the descriptions of it. The great city in this period of time. There are some who say this is Jerusalem, but I think here clearly, or some say it's Jerusalem and Rome. But I think the great city here in this time would have been a reference to Rome. The 7 hills are a reference to Rome, is the way that I would understand this. And also it says these 7 kings who have fallen, but that there is one who is yet to come, this 8th king who is yet to come. And again, depending on how we count the emperors, I think that's what it's a reference to. And John's giving us an idea of the time in which he's writing. Okay. And it says, anytime he says this takes a mind for wisdom, he's basically saying, I'm going to kind of couch this in terms that, will not get us all in trouble, but
use your brain,
and figure this out.
Thinking,
right. Right. So that's what I think is going on here. So, and again, the destruction is what's ultimate.
That's the main message here is there have been some, and it's going to be destruction.
Yeah. So I'm going to read 12 through 14. It says, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who've not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour, and here again, anytime we have this short time and saying just a little while, don't nothing to worry about, who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. So here we probably are thinking about other kingdoms around that are giving their authority and power to Rome. And this is what Rome, the horror of Babylon is deriving her power and strength from, but that's only for a short time, for an hour, and then those will be gone. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. So again, the message is one of triumph of the Lamb, and so we don't need to worry. Verse 15 is what I referred to earlier. The angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So here I think is the idea, again, this is the connections that Rome has with all of these places. This is their, so languages, for example, if there's messages that are transmitted, they're going to come, across the sea on boats, up the river. This is how transmission of information is going to take place during this period of time. That's how trade takes place. That's how political allegiances take place in all this. So And then it says, verse 16, the beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So ultimately, there's going to be this rebellion against Rome when they begin to see that Rome is no longer able to, and this is where I think this is future in the time of John, when they see that Rome is no longer able to protect them or herself, for that matter, when they begin to see,
devoured,
then they will basically all of the wealth and everything that she has taken to herself will be up for grabs, so to speak. So then it says, for God has put in their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. And then very plainly, John says, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So this is the idea. So again, I said we're going to talk a little bit about, and we've talked along the way about application as well. So in a very specific way, he's saying, don't worry about Rome. There's going to come a time, just like Babylon, when Babylon, God used Babylon for a period of time. God is using Rome for this period of time. But there is going to come a time where they're going to also receive the due of what they have done, especially to God's people. The same way that Babylon has oppressed God's people in the Old Testament, they're eventually going to receive their destruction. Rome is the same. Rome is not going to be the eternal city, right? Even though it is, that's what they call it. But you get what I'm saying? This empire is going to crumble. It's going to fall. And even at that point, these kings that were in alliance with them are going to turn against her. And so God, the message here for God's people is, even when it might seem that things, the power of this evil, oppressing empire is there forever, it isn't forever.
Right.
And Rome endured as an empire much longer, for example, than our own country has existed. But there will come a time, is the message, when that will come to an end. And I think it's the same for us. We how do I say this? One of the messages I think that we have to take away is that even we can be seduced by different ways of wielding power. We can be seduced by putting our trust in various authorities and various powers, when we need to recognize the only eternal power, the only eternal authority is God himself. And the Lamb is the one who ultimately will be victorious over all the kings of the earth. And our trust goes to him. That's the main message. And so the way that we live in whatever political or economic or cultural context we find ourselves in, it's a question of not allowing the idols of this world to turn aside our hearts and our allegiance from the worship of the true God, is the way I would say it.
Yeah. I think about the context of this, and we've talked at one of the conversations I've read in the commentaries is like, was John really writing about Rome? There's no way he could have got this message out, because Rome would have censored the message, because he talked about the fall of them, but also that this was during the Great Roman Peace.
Sure.
And it was almost impossible for anyone to think that this incredible city, this city that has dominated, and we talked about this as, Alexander the Great moved quickly through and conquered, but didn't really establish any hard for a long time. And then here comes Rome, just grinding down people to a pulp and ruling. And it was just this idea of like, well, Rome is, we've got all the jewels and the gold, and they're trading in people, and everyone's coming to them. And it's this time of peace, but it was, you rise up, we kill you, we're still here, we're not leaving. And so this and I think for us, as we think today, and it's probably easier for us today in the United States, sometimes we feel very divided. There's been a time in our past we felt like we're solid, we're strong, there's nothing that can come against us. But even internally, we can see that there's like that we can't place our trust in a country, we can't place our trust in a system, we can't place our trust in an economy. We can't play, that God is, and what we have is a temporary system inside of.
I think it's a matter of perspective. And the thing is, you start talking this way, and there are people who begin to think, oh, you're being un-American, or you're being, and not at all. I'm God. I think, in the same way that God has established all nations, I would say, that there are very particular blessings that we have enjoyed to this point in our nation, and sometimes we don't even recognize until we begin to, as you and I both have done, travel into places where things are significantly different. Mm-hmm. But God, we have to keep in mind that God has always given us these blessings to be used to continue and work furthering His kingdom, continuing the work of His kingdom. The blessings that we have aren't for the continuation of this nation; it's for the continuation of His kingdom, which is ultimately the eternal. And so there's this the scary thing for us to, scary is not the right word exactly, but the thing for us to be very careful of is I think we can even be seduced. We say this all the time. We can even be seduced by the good things that God gives us if we make them the ultimate thing. Mm-hmm. God gives us family, and we're blessed by our families, but our family cannot be before God. Right. God is, it doesn't work any other way. Mm-hmm. Anything we put before God, ourselves, another person, an idea, anything we put before God becomes an idol. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is being warned against here. There's, commercial success, commerce, trade, wealth, all those things we have to be very careful of. If they become our ultimate, then we've made them an idol.
Yeah, it's the examined life.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
It just, as John says, this calls for a mind with wisdom, and there's always this. We need to keep coming back to, are we using a mind of wisdom, or are we being apathetic and letting? Yeah, just as I was talking about that, like the blessings that we have is even in Rome. We talked about that Jesus came at a certain time in a certain place, but it was because of Rome that the message got. We had the Rome. There was a system in there that the roads and so forth, that the message could be carried out to the farther than just Jerusalem, and the language had been,
and the relative peace. I mean, all those things.
So there was good to it, but when that becomes that good of that becomes the primary and not the message, and not who Christ is, that's when we get ourselves in trouble.
So let me maybe just back up and use wealth. You mentioned wealth. Let me use it as an example, because that might be a little bit easier for us to see sometimes, even when I start talking about our nationhood. Mm-hmm. So again, what I said was that our being, for those of us who are listening in the United States, and I know we have people who are listening outside the United States. And again, this is the interesting thing about Revelation, is it applies in our context. But, we have certain blessings that we've been given, but those have been given for God's purpose, ultimately, not for, just a self-perpetuating kind of thing. Mm. So let me use wealth as an example. Wealth is not bad. That's not what the message is. The message is, if we make wealth the primary thing, we've made it an idol. If we are using that wealth on God's behalf for His purpose, then that's the proper order thing. Again, we're submitting ourselves to God's will and to God's purpose. But when the wealth becomes the primary thing, I know lots of people who have been blessed with, and they would say it's God's blessing of incredible wealth, but they're using it in ways that are for His kingdom. In other words, they have a proper perspective. And so that's what I'm saying. I'm not criticizing our citizenship. I'm not criticizing our nationhood, but we need to recognize, we need to make sure we're keeping it in the proper place. Right. And I think that's one of the temptations here. One of the reasons the nations that John is talking about are going to, share in these the uncleanness, is because they've been seduced by Rome's power to put their trust in Rome rather than putting their trust in God. And so the faithful and true person who maintains their testimony is ultimately putting their trust in God, is the way that I would say it.
And faithful testimony means living it, a living testimony.
Not only speaking. I mean, testimony has to do with speaking, but it has to do with living it as well.
Yeah, it's again, I'm going to call back to our Ephesians episode. It's not just what you abstain from. It's what you, holiness is what you do. It's how you live your life in that context. And we have to keep examining it. Like, have I exalted this over something else? And God's saying, like, whatever you've exalted over me, I will bring to ruin at some point, you
right.
know, and that my name will be first and foremost.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This is great.
All right. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot to talk about here in Revelation and to go through.
So what's coming up next? What do we have
I think we're
next?
going back to Ephesians. We're going to do the house list coming up, or the house, how to order the home. This is the one that gets spicy for some people.
Oh, we'll see if we can make it controversial.
It's not going to be controversial, but you
know, we can try.
Well, I'm sure we could absolutely do it. We could offend everyone all at one time. So anyway, but yeah, so we'll be back next week with going back to Ephesians, and we've just got 2 episodes
two more
left.
Episodes in Ephesians.
So if you've loved Ephesians, I'm sorry it's coming to a close. If you've not, I mean, we all like Ephesians, but if you've not liked it, you and I riffing on it for an extended period of time, that's coming to an end. But thanks so much for sharing Revelation. And just a reminder, if you're enjoying the podcast, that you can subscribe to Patreon and support our work. And you can find us on YouTube, and you can see our beautiful
give us likes, and we've said this, we haven't said this for a while. Give us good comments on Apple Podcast, always help, or whatever, wherever you listen to your podcast.
Yeah, it does help, and it is encouraging. You know, like we were having dinner and you showed me some comments. You know, it's sometimes it feels like we're talking into a void.
Sometimes we may be.
Sometimes it's just our own voices in our headphones. But yeah, we appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to coming back next Tuesday.
All right. We'll see you, Ryan.
Thanks, Brian.